Nathan, give us the nuts and bolts of why Notre Dame doesn't join a conference, if they should join a conference, if this is likely, unlikely, and then we'll kick it to you, Nick.
Before I answer, is there any other program that gets that? I feel like every time I'm on, I have to answer this question for you too. Is there any other program that gets, obviously not a join a conference question, but
BYU fans?
Does Texas get like the Texas is back every time you do a Texas
hammered with that? Yes. Yeah. Texas gets hammered for that. Georgia gets hammered with 1980. Miami gets hammered with you think you're elite. That was forever ago. There's a few easy, low-hanging fruit for certain programs. You also got a 1988 listed in here a couple times as well, so that comes down.
Yeah,
but
well, it should at least be 1993, but we can get into that another day.
Yes, I've defended 1993 on numerous occasions because that would have been
like,
my
I
vote
was barely
as well.
born by then. I'm a youngster, but
talk about head-to-head. There you go.
I mean,
go ahead, Nick.
The thing that bothers me I shouldn't say. Not that I expect everyone to know the history of every college program and the inner workings of conferences and whatnot. But if you have a problem with Notre Dame not joining a conference, like, I know it's tough to get in your time machine and go back, but if you have a problem with it, then go complain to Fielding Yost at Michigan, because Notre Dame tried to join what was the Big Ten for years and years and years, was told not only they couldn't join what was the Western Conference at the time that turned into the Big Ten, but the teams from that conference were told not to schedule Notre Dame. So that's why you had Notre Dame taking on Army in Yankee Stadium. That's why you had Notre Dame jumping on a train and traveling cross country to start that rivalry with USC. That's why you had that part of it. And now that, not now, but in the years that followed, that Notre Dame turned into one of the true national programs in college football. Oh, well, come join the Big Ten. Why don't you join the Big Ten? Why the hell would I want to join the Big Ten? Well, you didn't want me back then. Went and self-made yourself is what Notre Dame ended up doing by getting creative, creating the USC rivalry, creating the Army rivalry for those years. And why would Notre Dame want to join the Big Ten? I look at it and it's, if you absolutely have to, I just don't see that situation right now, because there's people that are out there, and I've seen it a couple on the comments that have gone on, of the 12th game versus the 13th sample size. And it's like, okay, well, you want to compare the 13th sample size of playing Mercer or playing an FBS school or whatever it might be? Like, is that really that big of a difference? Do you want to take that into comparison? Because I look at that and I just don't see if you know the history of it whatsoever, it makes a heck of a lot more sense of why Notre Dame doesn't really have interest in joining a conference anytime soon for football.
And I think what goes on now, I don't even know if they necessarily hold that against the Big Ten or anything like that anymore. They maybe do. I think in today's college football landscape, until teams say they're not going to schedule Notre Dame until they join a conference, which I don't think will happen, because they're such a name brand that people want to play them regardless if they're up or down or whatever. It's not a huge deal at this point. And then the other thing is, I think Notre Dame just likes to play their national schedule. I'm not saying it's the best schedule in the country. That's not the point I'm trying to make, but they love playing USC and Stanford every year. They love playing Navy every year. They love being able to go into NFL stadiums and do their Shamrock Series on a yearly basis. They like scheduling SEC teams. They like scheduling Big Ten teams. They like scheduling, they like having their ACC teams that they play on a yearly basis. So and then obviously the NBC contract, I think they enjoy it, but they also don't make as much money as they would in a conference with the NBC contract. So the idea that the money is kind of keeping them from, joining a conference is sort of an outdated, I guess, way of thinking. I think that used to be kind of part of it maybe 15, 20 years ago, before all these conferences had their own, TV contracts. But right now, Notre Dame probably makes less than most of the teams in Power 5 school, or most Power 5 programs do. from TV deals. But they're certainly watched on NBC, and I think that's proven on a yearly basis when you look at the numbers. When Notre Dame plays Clemson at home and it's an NBC, it's probably the most watched game of the year, and so on and so forth. And when they do play on ESPN or ABC or whatever network they end up playing on, it's typically has some of the higher ratings. So to me, it really goes back to just being able to schedule who they want to schedule, play where they want to play. And I really don't think, there's been some comments here about how we sound whiny and how Notre Dame fans want to complain about not making the college football playoff. I don't think myself or Nick have complained about not making the college football playoff.
Cincinnati. That's as simple as that. Show up with a game plan against Cincinnati and win that game, and you're in the playoff. It's really not.
So to me, it would be easier for Notre Dame to make the college football playoff if they joined a conference. And I'm okay with it not being easy. Win all your games or go 11-1 and see what happens. To me, that's all that matters. And I think there's a lot of times where Notre Dame will go 11-1 and they'll make it. Next year, if they go 11-1 and one of their losses is to Clemson or Ohio State, but they beat the other, they probably have a really good chance of making the college football playoff. If they go 12-0, they're certainly going to make the college football playoff. So to me, it's really like Notre Dame knows when they're going to make the college football playoff every year. If they go 12-0, they're going to make it.
Well,
just like any other Power 5 team. If they go 12-0, 13-0, they're going to make it. If Notre Dame goes 11-1, then they have a chance to make it just like anybody else that loses the game.
Yeah, to Nathan's point, it's not like you look at Notre Dame's future schedules here, and it's not like they're struggling right now to find big-time opponents. They start next year at Ohio State. They have Clemson on the schedule. USC's on there every year. USC, you would think with Lincoln Riley, that's going to have a boost and going to be a top 10, top 15 program, again, unlike it's been for the last decade or so. But you think that they're going to be back and be competing for Pac-12 and national titles here before too long, one would think. And then you look beyond that, the home and home scheduled with Texas A&M in coming years, Alabama in coming years. They're not struggling right now to find big time programs to play. And until that changes, there's going to be no pressure whatsoever on Notre Dame to join a conference.
So I've got a lot of thoughts about this. Some are anti-Notre Dame, some are pro-Notre Dame. So first and foremost, Notre Dame has no responsibility to the rest of college football. Notre Dame needs to act in a way in which benefits Notre Dame. And until they are forced to do something or the conditions are made in such a way that make it difficult for them, why should they act? They're going to do what's best for them, and they should. I am going to admit to a bias as a guy that grew up as a college football fan in the Midwest in Big Ten country and watching Notre Dame play Michigan, Michigan State, and Purdue every year. I got accustomed to that and always thought Notre Dame should be in the Big Ten. They're obviously geographically right in the middle of Big Ten country. And in terms of not just geographically, but in regards to the history of those series and just the style, the brand, the tradition, the decades long of football tradition seems to fit Big Ten culture from a football standpoint.
Yeah, for sure.
From an AC, to me, the ACC and Notre Dame from a football standpoint is a stretch. It just doesn't fit from a football standpoint. I've always defended Notre Dame's schedule because, to your point, both of you, Notre Dame has scheduled a national schedule that, of course, nobody can guarantee that they're going to play the toughest schedule in the nation every year, nor should they play the toughest schedule, but it's always a formidable schedule. And when you're scheduling USC and Virginia and Stanford, of course, and some of the other games that they're scheduling on a regular basis, that has veered off of the Michigan State, Purdue portion of that. But it's always a formidable schedule. So the complaints that most people have in College Football Nation against Notre Dame's schedule in recent years is not levied against other teams that play pretty weak schedules just because they're bound to a conference schedule. I do think that, to Nick's point, of course, USC and Stanford have not been very good in recent years. For Stanford, it's been quite a while. For USC, it's been a bit sporadic, but nowhere near what they were in the early part of the 2000 teens. 10 or 12 years ago. In addition to that, I think this contract with the ACC has watered down Notre Dame's schedule. When they're giving you a rotation of the Louisvilles and Dukes and Georgia Techs in place of Michigan State, Purdue in particular, that's going to diminish the schedule. But again, Notre Dame doesn't need to play a killer schedule. Their schedule, even in an off year, when they made the playoff in 2018, their schedule was knocked, but it was Florida State, Virginia Tech, USC, Stanford were down. Those are typically really good football programs that are going to field anywhere from 8-4 to 11-1 football teams most of the time. But on that particular year, and for recent years, they haven't, and that's not Notre Dame's issue.
Yeah, so my thoughts on the ACC. I never was a big fan of joining the ACC as like a part-time member or whatever you want to call it. I actually really enjoyed playing Michigan State, Purdue, even Michigan on a yearly basis. Part of it because those are traditional rivals. Part of it because, like what you mentioned, I think the style of play fits Notre Dame a little bit better, at least in regards to just like the eye. I guess the eye, like what's nice to the eye, if that makes any sense. I mean, Notre Dame certainly fits the bill of Big Ten football a little bit better. I do like playing Clemson and Florida State, and obviously Miami's been a Notre Dame rival as well. So I mean, those are fun. I mean, Boston College, Pitt, kind of the same thing in that regard. So I don't know if I think it's maybe as bad as you do when it comes to the fit for Notre Dame overall. And I part of me does like having kind of like that set schedule on a yearly basis that a conference would sort of bring you. But yeah, I mean, and I think it was Mason, my good buddy Mason, who actually is part of the Golden Homers podcast with me, my co-host. He brought up with the expansion. I mean, it's going to even be less incentive for Notre Dame to join a conference because they're pretty much going to make it every year or close to it, at least with the way that they're playing right now. If that continues, I mean, if there's ever a 12-team playoff, I mean, Notre Dame's essentially going to be in, 90-95% of the time, unless they plummet. So I think it will even be less incentive for them to join a conference. And I do want to address one other thing before Nick, I know, goes. Someone mentioned that I said that if Notre Dame goes 12-0, they'll make the college football playoff every year. That's not really what I meant. I meant that most years they're going to make the college football playoff if they go 12-0. Certainly next year if they beat Ohio State and Clemson. I don't think that they would need a 13th data point to make the college football playoff over an undefeated Power 5 team. But in general, 12-0 Notre Dame will go 99% of the time because you're not going to see all Power 5 teams go undefeated or a team from all Power 5 conferences go undefeated most years. So a 12-0 Notre Dame team would go to the college football playoff the majority of the time. If I needed, I didn't realize I had to to rephrase that for people.
Yeah, it's how many times do we sit here in the middle of September or early October and it's like, okay, well, these teams are clearly going to win out because they're ranked in the top 4 or top 5 right now. And every year we around the same part of the year. Okay, well, there's an upset. Here's an upset. Oh, Oregon just lost at Stanford, whatever it might be. Like it seems like every year we have this conversation, and every year it ends up playing out that okay, well, there's only 1 or 2 unbeatens at the end of the year. Sometimes there's a crazy third one, but even that's a reach more often than not.
I guess the year that it hit me, because I had always defended Notre Dame's schedule for all the people that said they got to join a conference. They got to join a conference. It's not fair. They're sitting at home when these other conference championship games are going on for a 13th data point. And I've always said, well, yeah, but if you look at the entirety of the schedule, their 12 games are difficult. They're typically in the top 10 or 20% of strength of schedules in the country. But in 2018, that undefeated Notre Dame team not playing a 13th data point, and Oklahoma and Ohio State were kind of stalemated at 12-1 as conference champions. And then especially considering what later happened, which none of us could have predicted in 2020 when Notre Dame joined the ACC for one season. But even sitting there in 2018, I thought Notre Dame could be playing Clemson right now in the ACC championship game if they would join the conference in all sports. And then that would solve this this 5-team issue here. But That's what it is.
And I think the other point I would make is I think every time Notre Dame's made the playoff, I feel like they deserved it. And I think every time they haven't made the playoff, I think that they deserve not to make it. So I think overall the committee's gotten it correct. I think almost every year in regards to allowing all teams in, they've gotten it correct. But in regards to Notre Dame, is that's the team we're talking about and covering right now. That I think Notre Dame, I don't think they've been slighted, nor have they been favored in any way when they've made it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's also, I mean, you look back to 2015, and if Notre Dame makes one stop against Stanford at the end of that game, they're probably in that college football playoff. Like they're right there. I don't think that there's this instant this need, I guess, for Notre Dame necessarily to just join it. I think that it's a fun conversation for a lot of outsiders with it, of people that maybe don't follow Notre Dame as closely. And okay, well, it'd be cool if Notre Dame was in the Big Ten. Yeah, it would be neat. Nationally, it would be neat to see Notre Dame join any conference. But in terms of what's in the best interest of the program, what's in the best interest of the university, it's being independent, and it's being what they are and what they've always been.
Mark, I have a question for you actually. Before, I know people probably want us to move on from these as well, but what's your take on the FCS argument? I know D-Rock Irish, who's always in here, brought it up, and I've heard that argument before, but I'm curious on teams that play FCS opponents. There was actually, I'd have to pull up the tweet, and it would take me a while, so I can't, but I can kind of remember it to an extent. Someone mentioned that Notre Dame played Toledo this year, and that's essentially an FCS opponent. And then I think it was actually Brian Driscoll, who's been on your show a few times. He put out the tweet, but like I said, it was a while back. I'd have to find it. He mentioned that the last 8 times or something like that Toledo has played an FCS opponent, they've won all of them, and then they've averaged those wins against good FCS opponents. If you look at those FCS opponents' records, I think one of them won the national title that year, or something like that. Their average margin of victory was 28 or 35 points or something like that. So comparing Toledo to an FCS opponent to me is ridiculous. It's an easy game most years. I mean, Notre Dame obviously struggled. But in general, I don't think Toledo or playing Navy or whoever should be compared to an FCS opponent. But I'm curious on what your take is in regards to the 13th data point when a lot of these teams play FCS opponents. Because I can see both sides. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah, I outlined a situation in which the 13th data point was taken as a conference championship game against a difficult opponent, just if you're taking them in order versus Notre Dame sitting on the couch. But of course, if you're taking the entirety of the season, yes, you're uncovering the Mercers and the Citadels and the Tennessee Chattanoogas on a lot of schedules that typically the Big Ten doesn't play too many of those. The SEC plays a pretty strong hand of those opponents, and others do as well. There is a decided difference between playing a top half of the MAC school or Sunbelt school versus taking on your typical FCS opponent. Yes. Are there FCS outliers that compete against some teams in major conferences? Have there been some FCS national championship caliber teams that have beaten Kansas State and Illinois and some teams, some lesser teams in the Big 12 and the Big 10? Yes.
We got to throw out Michigan there with that.
Those are outliers. What's that?
So we got to throw up, just because it's a Notre Dame thing.
There you go.
And Michigan.
That's the one right there. Yes, there are outliers. Everybody, just like when we were talking about recruiting, we can sit here and talk about the 2 stars like J.J. Watt that are going to be a Pro Football Hall of Famer. Yes, if we want to comb through the thousands and thousands of players to get the examples to support that. But there's no question that Notre Dame has no apologies to make for its strength of schedule. They are playing a 12th game instead of a 13th game that other teams are playing that get into the college football playoff, because we've never had a situation in which a team has not reached its conference champ. One time, 2 times that a team has not reached its conference championship game, Ohio State in 16, Alabama in 17, and reached the college football playoff. But it's somewhat rare.
And I think on the other side of that, and this is why I said I can see both sides. I mean, playing a 13th game does, allow for an injury or, or whatever, a suspension because of, a targeting or whatever. So there are things in the 13th game where, Jamison Williams, I know that this wasn't against an FCS team, but when Jamison Williams had the targeting against Auburn, that completely changed that game. If that would have happened a week prior when they did play an FCS team, or I don't know if it was a week prior, but just as an example, and Williams missed the first half of Auburn or missed the first half of Georgia or so on and so forth, I think that certainly plays a role. And then obviously, or someone tears an ACL or gets a concussion and they miss big games. That's where I kind of agree with the 13th data point to an extent. But again, I was really just curious on your take, because I do think that there's an argument to be made when sometimes teams schedule 2 FCS opponents. I think Oklahoma State did that this year, actually. And so just an interesting one, because it's talked about a lot when it comes to Notre Dame and their lack of a 13th data point.